Hello again. And welcome to the third session of our self-kindness retreat. You might be wondering whether this is the session where we will actually start doing self-kindness. And in a way, yes, in that everything that we're doing here is taking us in that direction. But simply to explain why we are taking some time to establish these more foundational steps, I'll very briefly share my personal story with self-kindness. And that is something that I voice quite often. If you have ever participated in classes on the 4 measurables that I very humbly facilitate, then you probably have heard this story, and it's not very exciting, but it's fairly simple. I kind of can roughly divide my life into 2 parts: before I did my first long-term loving kindness retreat and after. And by the time I did that retreat, I was already a Buddhist monastic for a number of years. I was already kind of an aspiring practitioner for quite a while, for some years. I was already a Buddhist for a number of years. I was already a Buddhist translator for a number of years. And I was already familiar with the practice of loving kindness, certainly. So I did it in my daily life, on the level of my daily life. And still, after all of that, and having been familiar with the Buddhist tradition, having translated for many wonderful teachers by then, still, I received incredible benefit from actually doing a full-on loving kindness retreat. I'm not saying this is strictly necessary for everyone. I'm not saying this is, a major ritual of transition for everyone. Not at all. Some people might have transformative experiences of different kinds with regards to other retreats, with regards to their daily practice that is not done in a retreat setting. But for me personally, with my unique personal history, my predispositions, my traumas also, and many other things, there was a lot of benefit in doing that retreat. And half of my first longer term loving kindness retreat was focused on loving kindness towards myself. The second half was on universal loving kindness, gradually going through the sequence of objects that's described traditionally. Because after we have worked on loving kindness for ourselves, in the traditional instructions that are offered, for example, by Buddhaghosa, we then go on to a benefactor, and then the whole category of friends. Then we would switch to so-called strangers, meaning people we feel neutral about. Then we would move on to our quote-unquote enemies, those we feel uncomfortable with. And eventually, after we have broken down the barriers, after we have equalized the opposite categories of beings, we will extend loving kindness to all and abide in that. And through that, eventually, if we practice really deeply, we would even accomplish shamatha, single-pointed concentration that can serve as a wonderful foundation for our insight practices, but also for all the other types of training that we might need to undertake on the Buddhist path. So that was the second half of the retreat. But for the first half, just working on loving kindness for myself in a kind of a mind-numbing way, where you just sit there for hours of practice, and you just say repeatedly, "May I be happy," or "May I be happy and have the causes of happiness," or you use another set of phrases for generating the same aspiration, but you do it again and again and again and again and again, quite literally, just using that little hammer of your practice to break through all the barriers, all the obstacles, all the objections, all the layers and levels of shame and guilt and self-hatred and toxic internalized types of inner dialogue and so on. That is just something that in a way has to happen. It was so transformative and so beneficial, and also required a lot of patience and just understanding, yes, I don't need to wait for anything specific to happen right now, but every moment I'm investing in this process will be transformative. So in a way, we could just go straight into that. We could just, start the retreat and then start by going immediately into the practice of self-directed loving kindness. And quite literally, we could spend, and it would be a very meaningful endeavor, just spend these 3 days together, sitting with that one phrase, with that one aspiration of, may I be happy. Or in the Tibetan approach, may I be happy and have the causes of happiness. Or may I be well and happy. Or we could use some of the more elaborate sequences of phrases. So we could do that, and we will get to that. But what in retrospect I wish I knew was that this process of generating self-directed loving kindness could have been made more efficient were it to be supported by a number of other important practices. And these important practices I have later learned from many of my teachers. So step by step, they were adding these missing bits to the whole sequence of self-kindness. And in retrospect, I now understand that, were I to have those elements ahead of time, were I to train on those elements, my practice of loving kindness would have been so much more powerful, and it would have taken less time for me to generate even the relatively humble levels of self-directed kindness that I emerged out of my retreat with. Yes, they were infinitely deeper than they were initially, but still, there's always more to be developed. There's always more to be gained until we're fully awakened. So there's always more that could be had. And my levels of self-directed loving kindness and universal loving kindness would have been much deeper were I to know of all this preparation. And it's this preparation that we're focusing on right now. Why? And hopefully this will become apparent just as you gain this practice experience as well, or as you revisit it. You probably all have more practice experience anyway than me. And as I always say, I'm only facilitating these events, these retreats, these classes, in the role of the worst student in class who has been tasked with delivering a clear presentation using some slides and some notes and so forth, using some structures to remind everyone in class, remind all the other students of the important points pertaining to the material. But of course, this student is the worst student in class, so there's no attempts to present myself as anyone knowledgeable or anything like that. Still, the material itself is valid because it comes from these wonderful sources, and that's why I try to reference them very clearly. So for our next practice, there are two major reference points in history and in the source material. This practice is used both, well, in a way we could say there are many practices of a similar nature across multiple contemplative traditions. But in the ones that we're relying on right now, the reference point, the primary reference point that I'm familiar with in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is Padmasambhava, and in particular, these are Padmasambhava's instructions on 9 types of resting. This is generally a common point in the Great Perfection or Dzogchen tradition, so these 9 types of resting are frequently referenced, and I've heard lamas that I translated for, interpreted for, or just received teachings from reference those, probably because they're mentioned in multiple sources, but for those familiar with the teachings and works of Lama Alan Wallace, you would find an explanation of the 9 types of resting in the book called Natural Liberation. And this is the practice that Lama Alan then teaches under the name of settling body, speech, and mind in their natural states. So there's 3 points related to the body, 3 points related to the speech, and 3 points related to the mind in Padmasambhava's original instructions. But it can all be simplified and explained as simply allowing our body, speech, and mind to rest deeply in a fusion, in a union of relaxation, stillness, vigilance for the body, relaxation, stability, and clarity for the mind. So that's the first tradition. For the second tradition, the same practice, or largely similar practice that is pretty much the same, I would say, has been quite widely propagated in kind of the Buddhist and Buddhist adjacent circles by a Bön master, Bönpo master by the name of Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, whom once again many of those present would be familiar with. So Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, and Bön is in the indigenous spiritual tradition of Tibet, but of course both Bön and Indo-Tibetan Buddhism have been influencing each other for many centuries, and therefore there's been a lot of ideas that were exchanged. There is a lot of similarities, there's a lot of parallels. So the Bön tradition also practices great perfection or Dzogchen, and of course, since Dzogchen is the same Dzogchen in a way in both traditions, it relies on the same terminology quite largely, it revolves around the same ideas, it uses very similar practices. It would also have this practice, the practice of 9 types of settling, basically the practice of a profound rest, profound relaxation. But to make this practice a little bit easier to understand and connect to for Westerners, Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche started presenting it using kind of a cheeky terminology, describing it as the practice of 3 pills. So when asked, why do you refer to these 3 key principles, 3 key points as pills, he facetiously says, well, that's because Americans love pills. So when I describe it as the practice of 3 pills, they immediately find it easy to connect to. They think, oh, okay, for this problem I can take this pill, for this problem I can take that pill, for that problem I can take that pill, the 3rd pill. So altogether we have 3 pills that can be either applied separately or together. Okay, a great marketing solution. But it's the same practice of just allowing our body, speech, and mind to rest deeply in a state of inactivity, in a state of profound rest. Why do we do that? For 2 reasons. One reason is, once again, to simply prepare us for any other practice, any other method that we might want to use, including such practices as training in loving kindness for ourselves and then in universal loving kindness. Training in compassion for ourselves, and then in universal compassion. Okay, so that's one reason to do this. Just like with mindfulness of breathing that we were doing earlier, or kind of the mindfulness of breathing in which we also relied quite heavily on the earth element within our body. This is done, or this can be done as preparation for any other practice. Okay, that's valid, that's good already. But of course, in the Dzogchen tradition from which these methods come, these practices, whether referred to as 9 types of settling or 9 types of resting or the 3 pills, are also used to help us gain a certain experience of our own deeper or deepest nature. So these are practices that can slowly, if applied gently, and without excessive expectations, these are practices that can gradually provide us with some glimpses of our innermost nature, which is spacious, luminous, and loving, or spacious, luminous, and compassion, or spacious, luminous, and blissful. There are slightly different ways of describing that nature, but suffice it to say, it usually is described as having these 3 facets that are indivisible from each other. One facet is the facet of spaciousness or boundlessness or emptiness, meaning there's nothing fixed there. There's nothing that exists in and of itself. There's nothing that's limited. There's nothing that's bound in plastic. There's nothing that has a thick line around it. Okay, so boundlessness, spaciousness, emptiness, that's one facet of it. The other aspect is luminosity, clarity, or luminosity that is also cognizant. Sometimes this would simply be called cognizance. Okay, so there's certain luminosity, brightness, awareness to it. And then in the connection between spaciousness and luminosity, spaciousness and clarity, arises the 3rd quality, which is described as this natural warm-hearted resonance for all who live. And this natural warm-hearted resonance is sometimes referred to as all-pervading compassion, Tugje Kunkyab, but it can also be described in different ways. But most commonly, all these foundational terms for benevolence are used. Sometimes it's simply referred to as love, or our potential for love. All-pervading compassion is a fairly standard term. Sometimes there would be references to bliss instead of compassion and love, and bliss here once again has the same undertone of warm-heartedness. But whichever term we use, this whole union of these three qualities is described as our deepest nature. To fully experience that and to abide in that recognition 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, would be tantamount to full awakening. That's the simple thought that's quite often used in the tradition of great perfection and in the tradition of great seal. To truly recognize the ultimate nature of our mind and to truly rest in that ultimate nature all the time is full awakening. At this stage, however, we're not aiming that high, right? You might already be there, but I'm describing everything right now from the point of view of a beginner such as myself. So a beginner such as myself would start with practicing to initially get some glimpses of spaciousness, some glimpses of luminosity, some glimpses of that inherent warm-heartedness here and there. Slowly, slowly, without expecting too much, without pushing, without forcing anything. Through relaxation, through releasing, through dropping more deeply into this restful state of body, speech, and mind, I would gradually, here and there, start feeling that spaciousness. And because my goal here for this retreat specifically, as a practitioner, is to experience greater degrees of self-kindness, these glimpses of spacious, luminous warm-heartedness would serve as a very, very good foundation for genuinely being kind towards myself. So the first strategy, or the first method that we used, was to, yes, work with our breath, yes, work with our earth element, but then use that to see that our body is a network. By extension, our mind is also a network, and because they are networks, they are easier to love than if they were these little fixed things that are inherently poor quality. Oh, this ugly body. Oh, this horrible deluded mind. Oh, this inherently unlikable, unlovable person that is me. Blech. I hate those. So instead of seeing them as that, seeing them as vibrant fields that are shifting, transforming, that can evolve, that can reveal their beautiful nature over time. Okay, there might not yet be there, but over time it might happen if we direct their evolution. So that's already a big shift. Here, strategy number 2. Instead of focusing for now on this field, even though that field will still be implicated there, instead of focusing on the field and its shifts and its sensations and so forth, let's look through that into our deeper nature. And let's look into that deeper nature, that spacious nature, once again, not in a fanciful way where we necessarily call ourselves already advanced Dzogchen practitioners or anything like that, or claim to be constantly abiding in the true nature of our mind 24/7. No. Not making any of those fanciful, pompous statements, but simply working over time to relax more and more deeply into these 3 types of resting that Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche refers to as the 3 pills. And these are stillness for the body, silence for our speech, spaciousness for our mind. And as over time we connect more and more to stillness, silence, and spaciousness, just through connecting to that which transcends the surface level movements of our body, surface level movements of our speech, surface levels of our mind, through connecting therefore more and more deeply to spaciousness, luminosity, and warm-heartedness, we would feel an inflow of love towards ourselves from within, and greater lovability with regards to our body and mind when it comes to receiving love from the outside. So we would feel over time that some of that warm-heartedness comes from the very experience of spaciousness and flows into this very person. But because we are also becoming just less uptight, more relaxed, more spacious, more still, more silent in a way, or just more spacious, because that's the most important of the 3 qualities. Because we are becoming more spacious, our whole being sort of becomes more porous when it comes to receiving love from the outside as well. Simply because once again, that iciness, that ice block-like quality of our self-perception starts to give way to something that is more fluid. That comes through training in just this method alone. Even if throughout this retreat we did not do anything else, and we will do actually plenty of other things related to self-kindness, but even if we did not do anything else, and even if we skip the first method with which we work, the method of establishing naturalness in our breathing, even if we just focused on the 3 pillars of stillness, silence, and spaciousness, but we really took it deep by simply doing it again and again and again, by simply accumulating minutes and hours of that practice, the spaciousness that would emerge and our ability to use those 3 pillars as an antidote for any neurotic pattern that re-emerges or reactivates itself in our mind would become truly, truly impressive. And with that ability, we would be able to remove some of the problematic patterns, to undo them, to untie those knots. And that is the second application, or sort of the third application of this method. The first one is simply to prepare ourselves for any other type of meditation. That's wonderful already. The second one is to use this practice, the practice of stillness, silence, and spaciousness, to get glimpses into our deepest nature. That becomes extremely important if we are into practices of great perfection, great seal, or in the Chan tradition, natural illumination, and so on. Application number 3, using stillness, silence, and spaciousness as therapeutic tools for dealing with our neurotic patterns. And this includes our neurotic patterns of self-perception that give rise to such mental states as self-hatred, toxic shame, self-judgment, negative types of self-dialogue, inner dialogue. And then all of that, of course, gets projected outwards, and then we judge these people and we hate those people and so forth. So to reduce all of that, why not use the 3 pills in their therapeutic application? So we'll play with that a little bit as well, and that can actually help us clear some space for proper self-directed loving kindness later on. But for now, let's just play with this practice itself in a simple way. There are different ways of training in it. Sometimes Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche and his students divide the practice into 3 individual practices. So we could just practice with stillness for weeks, months, or years. We could practice with just silence for weeks, months, or years, and then the same for spaciousness. In this case, we will combine them in one meditation, but we will combine them in the manner of stages. So we will first focus on stillness, try to experience that, relax into that. Then we'll work with silence, and then we'll work with spaciousness. But before that, as usual, as an act of kindness for ourselves, we can stretch if that feels necessary, and then find a comfortable stationary position in our meditation nest. And that's where we'll go into the practice itself. To prepare ourselves for this meditation, once again allowing our mind to descend into the space of the body. Adjusting the different parts of the body as we see fit. And then, briefly reconnecting to the earth element that's holding us to initiate the process of relaxation. Noticing the firmness and the stability of the ground that's holding us. And performing an abbreviated body scan. Exploring the sensations in some of the key body parts, releasing the muscle tension there to the degree that's available to us. So we'll start with our feet and toes. And then legs in general. And then the pelvic floor. Relaxing and releasing, noticing the sensations. Then extending our awareness throughout our torso. To all the parts of the torso, including our shoulders. And then upper arms. Forearms. Hands and fingers. And then the back of our head, the crown, and the facial muscles. And then extending our awareness to the entirety of the body, to the whole field of tactile sensations, to the shifting experiences associated with the process of breathing, observing that. And then reconnecting to stillness, which is the first of the three so-called pills. Reconnecting to it by attending to the fact that our body is being still right now. The pith instruction, or the quintessential instruction for practice here, is very simple. To be still and to be aware of the stillness. So our attention is resting on the fact of physical stillness. And everything that is not this fact gets released with each new exhalation, along with all the types of deliberate movement and all the types of muscle tension. being still and being aware of the stillness, and coming back to the stillness every time our mind gets distracted. Then, for the second of the 3 pales, connecting or reconnecting to the silence of our speech. Our speech is currently silent. We're not saying anything. We're not reciting anything. We're not reciting prayers or mantras. We're not talking about anything. Just allowing it to rest in a state of inactivity. And our breath is flowing naturally in an uncontrived way. But simply being silent here is not enough. We also need to be aware of the fact of silence. Listening to this outer and inner silence with our entire being. And even if our inner dialogue starts distracting us, if there is that inner speech being activated for some reason, instead of attending to that speech, instead of listening to it, we listen to the silence that's hidden behind it. Going more and more deeply into this experience of being silent and being aware of the silence. With each exhalation, releasing everything into that state of silence. Just enjoying our connection to it. And then for the third one, spaciousness. Spaciousness is related to the mind. What it refers to is the fact that our mind is not limited to any of the specific mental events that it generates, any of its specific expressions. It is not limited to any particular thought, image, memory, emotion, desire, impulse. So instead of attending to them, to these individual mental expressions, we could attend to the underlying spaciousness. In the same way that in our room, in our physical space right now, we could attend to the furniture or to the space that's holding it all. So becoming disinterested with regards to the specific mental expressions and resting with the spaciousness that lies underneath all mental events. And if needed, releasing all types of grasping, all attempts to cling at a specific thought and so on, with a new exhalation. With each new exhalation if necessary. Releasing, releasing, and just resting with no particular expectations. And yet knowing that this process is bringing us closer to our deeper, spacious nature. And then from that nature coming back to our body to ground ourselves in its experiences. The tactile sensations in particular. Then introducing a tiny bit of movement to the body. Rocking back and forth, moving our fingers. Reactivating other muscle groups. And then slowly concluding the practice. And so once again, why do we do this? Why would we need it? How is it helping with self-kindness? Well, first of all, for any meditation practice, we do need proper preparation. And as was mentioned before, in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, specifically in the oral instructions for practice, and particularly in the Kagyu Nyingma traditions, sometimes there's a reference to these key points of body, speech, and mind. These are 3 points to go through as we prepare for any particular meditation practice. So the 3 pills here, stillness, silence, and spaciousness, actually correspond to those key points of body, speech, and mind. This is yet another way of describing those and working with those. So that's just preparation, good preparation, valid, intelligent preparation for other types of meditation. Once again, bringing us closer into a deep state of restfulness, and on the basis of that restfulness, we then start practicing everything else. So, reason number 1. Reason number 2, and I'm just repeating what I said earlier, but hopefully it will go deeper into our mind this way, certainly into my own mind. Reason number 2, the closer we come to any sort of glimpse into, or any sort of, all the glimpses that we get of that deeper, more spacious nature, will strengthen our practices of loving kindness, compassion, and so on. And we will actually need them eventually, these glimpses, to succeed in boundless levels of loving kindness, compassion, and so forth, to make those truly elaborate states more profound, deep, and stable, and eventually irreversible, or truly realized, truly integrated into our own mind. Reason number 3 is sometimes when we're practicing loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity, but really any meditation that's reasonable and wholesome and valid, we would be facing different types of obstacles. Some of those types of obstacles would be very fleeting and temporary. They would just be very temporary psychophysical experiences triggered by meditation, but they would in no way have any real control over our mind unless we imagine them to be real, unless we reify them, unless we give them that solidity. So those are so-called nyam, or fleeting meditation experiences triggered by meditation, but really insignificant unless we start reifying them and clinging onto them, grasping onto them. However, some of the obstacles that we face do not belong to that category. Some of the obstacles we face come from actual mistakes we make in meditation. That's another category. For example, being too tense when practicing, and therefore starting to develop headaches when we meditate. That's just a mistake. It's not nyam. It's not the third category that we're going towards. It's just a mistake that we're making in practice by not bringing in a sufficient degree of relaxation. Okay, that's easy to correct if we have proper instructions and if we have good teachers. Actually, that is why teaching meditation is a huge responsibility. So we better choose qualified teachers and rely on proper instructions, proper guidance, wonderful source materials, and so forth. And if we need actual personal instruction, we best approach qualified teachers instead of making stuff up. So that's point number 2. And point number 3, third type of obstacles that we might face in meditation. Not the fleeting temporary experiences of nyam category. Not mistakes that are easy to correct, but specific types of knots as in like knots on a thread, that have become embedded into our nervous system, our mind, our body, our kind of wiring, because of certain problematic experiences that we've had in this life. And of course, from a Buddhist point of view, it would still all be affected by our experiences in past lives. But usually for those knots to arise, there would be something that triggered them in this specific lifetime. So different teachers refer to these in different ways. Dzogchen Rinpoche has lately become quite famous for using the term beautiful monsters. Why? Because these knots that arise within our wiring kind of have a certain monstrosity to them, in that they're monsters and that they do make our life more difficult, and they actually make the lives of others around us more difficult because these are our issues, quote unquote. And so they are monstrous in nature, especially if we allow them to fully hijack our being and to control us. But they're also beautiful in that they are made out of our luminous, spacious energy. And they're actually trying to protect us. It's just that they are really misguided in their attempts to protect us. So traumatic responses, in a way, we could say, for simplicity, really simplifying it. Or I just like the term knots, because that's what these are in a way. Something has become kind of like a knot in our system, and then it kind of, every time our fingers run across it, it feels weird. And every time energy tries to flow through that specific channel, through that specific cable, it doesn't flow quite smoothly and it becomes convoluted, and there's some issues there. And yet, were we to undo the knot, well, the channel that we're working with, the cable, the thread, would return to its normal state, to its initial condition. Even though, of course, sometimes it's hard to undo a particular knot fully. And yet if we succeed, Dzogchen Rinpoche says, actually those beautiful monsters become our adornments. The more of these issues we're able to transform, the more we become kind of glorious in our way of being present in this world and in our ability to help others. So that is one of the reasons for why actually the best meditation teachers, the best spiritual teachers, also by extension I would probably guess best adepts of counseling in psychology, maybe best coaches as well, are people who have suffered a lot. That was one reason for why some of the earlier meditation teachers in the West were sent to the West back from India and other locations by their teachers with the invitation to teach. Why, some of them said, in particular Sharon Salzberg, for example, when she was encouraged by her teacher, Deepama, whom we will be referencing later in this retreat, when she was encouraged to go back to the West and start teaching meditation, Sharon said, well, why? I'm a beginner. What are you talking about? And Deepama said, well, actually, you'll make a good teacher because you have suffered a lot. So, that's not to say that someone who's had a fairly cushioned existence cannot become a meditation teacher at all. Not at all, no, but having had those beautiful monsters and then dealt with them successfully can be a very powerful source of positive experience and skillfulness that can then be shared with others. So learning how to undo these knots is a large part of our initial training on the spiritual path, ideally, because if we don't do this stage, if we don't work with the stage of dealing with our issues, dealing with our beautiful monsters, dealing with our knots, or dealing with our problematic schemas, as it's described in schema therapy, we would end up succumbing to what's known as the spiritual bypass. And that is a term that, as many people would know, was coined by John Wellwood, who was a personal friend of Dzogchen Rinpoche's, and a term that refers to us ignoring our actual emotional, mental, perceptual, sometimes psychophysical issues, and just diving straight into the depths of advanced spiritual teachings. So, for example, in this context, since we have already made references to the Great Perfection tradition, telling ourselves and others that we're a great Dzogchen practitioner, or just actually a Dzogchen practitioner, without making any attempts to strengthen our emotional intelligence, to deal with our insecurities, to deal with our beautiful monsters, to deal with our issues. Which is not to say we'll just do some of these practices and magically all of that will disappear, but to become very, very deeply familiar with this ground level of our being, with this kind of, or actually surface level of our being, with these things that get activated again and again and that other people can come across. This is a very helpful thing, a very necessary thing to avoid that spiritual bypass and therefore to actually go into genuine spirituality. So this very practice of 3 pills, stillness, silence, and spaciousness, is one of the techniques that can be used for dealing with the knots or with beautiful monsters. Mind you, Dzogchen Rinpoche suggests a slightly different approach. He has developed a practice that is, once again, fully based on Buddhist teachings, but also has elements of psychology to it, and that practice is referred to as the handshake practice. We're not going to go into that in this retreat, instead focusing on the 3 pills. So for the 3 pills, how do we use them to undo some of those knots? It's a very, very gentle approach, a very gentle strategy. Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche describes it sometimes as something we could actually do at any time, but it is also helpful to sometimes do it as a group on a specific occasion. He often recommends this practice of 3 pills for full moon days, new moon days, not because of any magical energy that would be in the air on those days, but just because, it's one more day on which we can practice together. So how to use that, how to apply this method specifically to our issues. So we're resting in meditation, we're resting in the union of stillness, silence, and spaciousness, or we're actually just resting in stillness, or just in silence, or just in spaciousness, because the other 2 are always kind of implicated. They're still present there. So we're resting in one of the 3 or in the union of all 3. And then something comes up. One of our problematic one of our issues, one of our problematic beliefs about ourselves, or one of the difficult emotions we might have with regards to our body and mind, or a specific thing that we find it difficult to forgive ourselves for. So absence of self-forgiveness is a huge obstacle to developing self-directed loving kindness, which is why I'm bringing this whole thing up in the first place. So something that we find ourselves difficult to forgive, something that we don't find it easy to forgive ourselves for. Or, once again, such issues as self-hatred towards our body, self-hatred towards who we are, self-hatred towards our mind, or deep shame about our horrible mind or our horrible body, or whatever it is. There are so many different beautiful monsters that we might have, right? So, and if we were to try to tackle each one of them using something like psychoanalysis, we might succeed to a certain degree, or not, but it will take a long time to track each beautiful monster down to the specific event that caused it, and then to try to transform them, blah, blah, blah. A very, very long process. For some people, helpful, for some not. But here, we're using a completely different strategy. So we're resting in meditation, something of that nature comes up, or we can very, very gently bring it up. And then we just, instead of focusing on it, trying to analyze it, dissect it, argue with it, and so forth, and some of these techniques would be used in some meditation traditions or cognitive behavioral therapy or even in insight practices. Instead of doing all of that, we just continue resting in stillness or in silence or in spaciousness or on all three all at the same time. So to give a very practical example, I initiate the meditation, I connect to the 3 pills, and then I bring to mind one of my beautiful monsters. And for me personally, one of my beautiful monsters is a profound sense of loneliness that comes up on occasion. Profound sense of total loneliness as a deep sense of isolation. So obviously that comes from negative conditioning and different types of experiences that I might have had at an early stage. Probably once again, Buddhism would say stuff from past lives as well. Astrologists would say, oh, you have this specific thing that has to do with your moon and how it's positioning in your chart. Doesn't matter. None of that matters for this practice. What matters is that I can bring it to mind. Oh, here's my feeling of loneliness, okay? And then I drop straight back into stillness, silence, and spaciousness. So I kind of invited that a little bit, but then I continue resting in something that is actually my own deeper nature. And within my own deeper nature, that loneliness has no grounding, it has no feet to stand on, it has no ground to rely on. And so, if it wants to hang out in this field that I've created of silence, stillness, and spaciousness, sure. If it wants to disappear, sure. Doesn't matter what it does. What matters is that while I'm resting in this kind of approximation of my own deeper nature, my beautiful monsters have no way of remaining the same for a long time, or they can't indefinitely remain the same, because I'm not feeding them, and because I'm resting in a mental state that is so profoundly different from the mental state out of which they arose. They arose out of a mental state that by definition had to include grasping, reification, a limited sense of self, a sense of isolation from others, and so on. Well, none of those things are relevant in stillness, silence, and spaciousness, because stillness, silence, and spaciousness are all facets of deeper, unified, or indivisible, or truly integrated nature. So I'm resting with that, and over time, some of those nodes become undone. They will become undone for the reasons that I've just voiced, because this nature of the 3 pills is so vastly different from nature out of which these beautiful monsters arose. So just gently bringing it in, and then letting it on its own do what it wants to, knowing that eventually it will kind of undo itself, unravel itself, but we don't need to force that process, and we don't need to expect anything. That is a common point for both this practice and the practice of handshake practice that Dzogchen Rinpoche suggests, in that expectations here kind of kill the process, they kill the vibe. If we expect very hard, oh, I brought this loneliness into my mind, let me look at how the 3 fields deal with it. well, the expectation itself will kind of become the focal object of our attention. And we will not be truly resting in the 3 pills while we're focused on that. And resting in it is what we need to do. So what are some of the things that we can apply it to in this case, in this process of cultivating self-directed kindness, self-kindness? Well, once again, I've seen it many times that I've seen the statement that absence of self-forgiveness is a major obstacle to self-kindness. That's probably true for many of us. But here, there are probably some benefit in defining self-forgiveness more clearly. Because once again, for those who are more deeply focused on the Buddhist tradition would know that, well, forgiveness is not really a major word in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, at least. There are some texts on releasing grudges, on letting go of grudges, specific mind training techniques that could be used for that. So we could say that's a type of forgiveness. But overall, there's the emphasis on forgiveness is not there, not in the same way that it's there, for example, for some of the Abrahamic traditions, or the Christian tradition in particular. But what is forgiveness? Well, from a Buddhist point of view, it would be described as the process of letting go of something, right? So in some cases, we would be letting go of resentment, grudge holding, and so forth. But in a more general sense, if we're thinking about self-forgiveness and forgiveness towards others, we could think of it as letting go of unrealistic expectations with regards to the past or with regards to the future, to the present. Sorry. So when I say, oh, I can forgive myself for something, what it means is that I'm still holding on to the expectation that I could be something else in the past. I could have done better. I could have known better. I should have known better. So that's an unrealistic expectation because in a way we always do the best we can, given our limited, confused perception of reality at each given moment, right? So yes, it is true that in the future, if I cultivate greater degrees of wisdom, I will do better. I will be a greater source of happiness for everyone else and myself and so on. But in the past, I did what I could, given the fact that I was under the influence of confusion, attachment, anger, and so forth. So for me to still be holding this profound sense of inadequacy and still be beating myself up and saying, oh, that was horrible and therefore I'm a horrible person, it's just me reifying everything, freezing everything, and then feeling bad about it all, and then constantly being on this vicious circle of having that expectation that can never be fulfilled because anyhow, the thing is in the past. So to let go of that expectation of the past being different is self-forgiveness with regards to the past. And then there's self-forgiveness with regards to the present. Because sometimes people, to use this language, which is not Buddhist language, but kind of pop psychology language, sometimes people voice the need to forgive themselves for being imperfect right now, which is an interesting way of wording it, an interesting experience, an interesting desire, an interesting aspiration to have. But if you share that wish, if you share that aspiration, if you do feel, like many people, that you need to forgive yourself for not being perfect right now, not being the perfect daughter or the perfect son or the perfect employee or the perfect creative or the perfect version of who you are, if that's a thing, which many people voice, it is for them, then this very method that we're discussing here can be helpful, extremely helpful in that regard. Because once again, when we're resting in stillness, silence, and spaciousness, these so-called 3 pills, there's no expectations there, right? Because it's just stillness, silence, and spaciousness. What expectations would there be? So if then this process of self-forgiveness is defined as letting go of unrealistic expectations, when we're resting in the 3 pills, when we perhaps gently bring to mind this feeling of lacking self-forgiveness, or if we find ourselves in a state where we are quite strongly under the influence of this emotion of not forgiving ourselves, and then from that state we try to connect to stillness, silence, and spaciousness, that is another approach. Already being in the midst of a strong emotional state, but then from there trying to reconnect to the three pills. In that case, over time, once again, the passion behind the expectations, the energy behind the expectations can slowly, gradually dissipate, and we will be finding ourselves in a state that is indeed more deeply imbued with self-forgiveness, or more free of unrealistic expectations. And in a similar manner, we could work with a great number actually, of other problematic mental states. But for now, let's do one more practice of stillness, silence, and spaciousness, using it in the way that was just described, in a way where we first go into the practice and we very gently bring to mind something that is in the way of us being truly comfortable with ourselves. But not the biggest issue, not the most traumatizing event in the past. No. Let's be very gentle. Let's start with something relatively manageable, relatively minor. So something relatively mild in terms of its emotional intensity. We have to really build up these muscles before we can tackle the big stuff. But something relatively minor. So for me, I know, for example, that yes, thinking that I'm sometimes full of self-pity and I feel lonely, I can manage that right now in meditation. I'm not going to start breaking down and crying and sobbing, in front of all of you. So for that reason, I know it's safe for me to bring up. So I will not now be thinking of the most, traumatizing, problematic events in my life, because this is not the time or the place. For now, choosing something mild, choosing something minor, but knowing even undoing a tiny knot is a victory. Even though we're not expecting to undo it right now, we're just introducing this type of work. We're starting on this healing journey. So choose something very, very insignificant, very minor, very mild, and then put it to the side for now, because first we'll need to find a comfortable stationary position. And then we'll need to come back to our two friends, the element of earth, the element of wind, the stability, and the process of breathing. So we'll perform an abbreviated body scan once again, starting with our feet and toes. And then extending our awareness to our legs in general, releasing the muscle tension, finding a sense of stillness there. The same for our torso. Our shoulders. Our hands and fingers. And then the back of our head, our crown, and our facial muscles. And from there, having performed this body scan, we can go straight into an experience of stillness. Being physically still and being aware of the stillness as the object of our attention. For our speech, noticing how it is resting in a state of inactivity, and there is an experience of silence behind and beyond, beneath all the expressions of inner and outer speech. There is an underlying flow of silence underneath all sounds and all acts of inner speech. So with our whole being, we're listening to this silence. And for our mind itself is not limited to any specific mental event, any specific expression of mental energy. It is not limited to specific thoughts, mental patterns, desires, memories, and so on. And instead of attending to them individually on its own, we can release them all into that boundless spaciousness and attend to the spaciousness itself, as if we were attending to the physical space around us instead of the furniture that is inside our room. And so, still, silent, and spacious, three facets of the same foundational nature. We are continuously releasing everything that is not in the nature of these three qualities, releasing with each new exhalation. We're allowing ourselves to rest. But at the same time, with just a corner of our mind, we can very briefly recall the specific, difficult pattern that we chose. Maybe it's just the way we sometimes speak to ourselves in a demeaning, negative way. Maybe it's just some of our difficult feelings that arise on occasion. Or some of our neurotic patterns of physical behavior when we try to distract ourselves from the sense of being bored or lonely, or when we try to make ourselves feel better by doing something with our body, and it doesn't really work. So just bringing something of that nature to mind very gently, not something dramatic, not something particularly significant right now. A minor pattern. And having acknowledged that unique pattern, that patterning that exists within our body, speech, and mind, we continue releasing and resting in the three pills. So it's as if we put this tiny image or this tiny pattern against the boundless background of stillness, silence, and spaciousness. Acknowledging, yes, this pattern exists, but also here is my deeper nature. Still breathing naturally, still resting, still experiencing stillness and silence and spaciousness. Releasing expectations as we continue to rest, which implies self-forgiveness. Spending one more minute in this fusion of the pills, where our body is still, our speech is silent, and our mind is spacious. And we're primarily resting in spaciousness. And then, bringing our awareness to the tactile field, noticing the sensations there, grounding ourselves in the sensations associated with the earth element, and slowly and gently introducing a tiny bit of movement to the body. Moving our fingers, moving our toes if we wish, rocking back and forth, and then slowly concluding the practice as we transition into our shared online space and into our physical space as well. So, for working with our knots, or beautiful monsters, or our schemas, and there are many other ways of describing those probably. Yes, one strategy is to walk all the way back to their origin with the help of a qualified counselor, for example, and then look at that origin, and then use specific tricks, techniques, approaches, and so on that a specific system of therapy prescribes in order to work with the origins of such experiences. That is one approach. There are probably many other therapeutic approaches, but the contemplative approach in this specific case is to use juxtaposition, to put a specific knot against the background of our deeper nature. And what we are not doing here is ignoring the knots. What we're not doing is pretending that they're not there. We are actually acknowledging an issue. That's very important. If our issue, like in my case, is recurring episodes of self-pity, recurring episodes of loneliness, profound loneliness, or something of that nature, it could be really anything, and we have all our unique combinations of these different things. So, acknowledging, yes, okay, I do have this thing, it is self-pity. I don't need to be judgmental about it. I don't need to blame myself for it. I don't need to feel too bad about it. Yeah, okay, that's my specific knot in this regard. Okay, no big deal. I mean, everyone has something. But I'm also not kind of complacent about it. I'm not arrogant about it. I'm not telling everyone to just deal with it and take me with these because that's who I am. And no, it's a temporary, conditioned configuration of mental and emotional energy. So I can acknowledge it. But then once I have acknowledged it, I'm also putting it against the background of stillness, silence, and spaciousness, which is kind of a glimpse into my own deeper nature. And it's in this contact between the two that the knots will gradually lose their power undoing themselves, because they just can't stand, they can't remain the same in the face of such kind of, we could facetiously say brilliance, but it is actually brilliance, because there are certain aspects of, our deepest nature, even in the stillness, silence, and spaciousness as they are available to us right now. There is certain brilliance and glory to them already. So yes, the knots cannot stand in their presence. And at the same time, stillness, silence, and spaciousness become deeper, our experience of them becomes deeper as well, because we're kind of strengthening the muscle of resting in that state, even when faced with these difficulties, with these difficult experiences. But we're being very gentle of it. So, a question sent to me here privately. I'll read it out and I'll respond to it. A very meaningful question. Are we specifically introducing the knot that we're aware of into the resting practice, or are we focusing on the resting practice while being mindful of a knot appearing? These are two things that we can do. Two approaches. They're both valid. One approach is we're just, hanging out, doing our best, moving through life, and then suddenly one of our knots get activated, right? So let's say I'm having a beautiful day, la-di-da-di-da, I don't know, I just had a nice dinner with friends, I'm walking, and then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, or with a specific trigger, I start feeling a relatively profound sense of loneliness. Okay, that happens. Something might have triggered it. In that case, it's an emotional episode, to use the cultivating emotional episode terminology. Or it might be kind of a more complex, diffuse state that we would describe as a mood. I'm just in a lonely mood all of a sudden, and there's no particular trigger that brought it about. But in either case, it is related to what I know for myself, right? As this knot of loneliness, of feeling isolated and so forth, unsupported, unloved, and perhaps even unlovable. Okay. Problem spotted. So I'm in that state. It got triggered already. I don't need to bring it up. What can I do in that situation? I can connect to stillness, silence, and spaciousness. And with regards to loneliness, because it's more on the emotional side of things, between the three, spaciousness would actually be the most helpful one. Let's imagine another situation. Happened to me recently. I just noticed that my mind is bringing up some judgmental thoughts. So it's just it's bringing up verbal thoughts that are kind of judgmental in nature, and I don't like to be judgmental if it's possible to avoid it. So I caught myself there and went into silence. Tried to connect to silence, to the pill of silence. Why? Because my problem was kind of verbal in nature. These were very specific verbal thoughts that my mind, due to some habits and some conditioning and underlying, mental afflictions and so forth, was churning up. So I noticed those verbal thoughts and that specific type of inner narration. I noticed that narrative, and instead of allowing myself to keep going down that line, I just decided the best possible solution is to connect to the three pills, but primarily to the pill of silence, because silence is directly opposed to, verbal issues or knots when they express themselves in a verbal form. It is possible also for me to notice myself feeling physically agitated. Maybe I'm just feeling anxious in terms of my body, or I'm feeling a certain neurotic energy in my body, or maybe I'm about to do something neurotic with my body. I don't know, throw a plate at someone that I'm angry with, or I don't know, just do something that's harmful for my body itself or harmful towards others, harmful for myself. So if I'm noticing that there's some kind of neuroticism manifest in my body or about to be expressed by my body, I could primarily connect to stillness. And silence and spaciousness would also be implicated in that. So that's one way of working with these. And Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche describes it that way when talking about how we could use the 3 pills to counteract what he calls the pain body, pain speech, and pain mind. What is this terminology? Well, it refers to kind of neurotic body, neurotic speech, and neurotic mind. That's what it means. Under the influence of some pain that we're experiencing, we kind of we lose balance, and therefore we're more likely to harm ourselves and others. So that's so-called pain body. So what to do with it? To use one of the 3 pills, or kind of to use them all together. However, so that's the first approach. The problem has already arisen, and we counteract it by doing something with the 3 pills. The other approach, which can be used sort of as a gentle, safe lab for working with some of our knots, is to already be in meditation, to establish that kind of deeper sense of spaciousness, stillness, and silence, to rest in it, and then just very, very gently to remind ourselves that we have a specific knot, and then to give that knot space against the background of the 3 pills. So that's another approach. That's kind of lab level approach. You're creating a safe space, and then you're working with your knots there very gently. That approach is also necessary in a way because, well, we don't always just want to wait for these problematic experiences to arise and then tackle them with the 3 pills, right? Sometimes we actually need preparation ahead of time. We need training in dealing with them. And if we do train this way, we will become more successful also in dealing with them when these knots do get activated by something externally. But to be very gentle with the second approach as well, because this is not for, going deeply into our deepest traumatic experiences and then hoping that the best, that it will just magically take us through. So, being very gentle with it. Another question here. Wouldn't connecting to silence to mitigate bad thoughts mean suppressing them, hence not inviting the knot that created them, but just not thinking about it? No, not necessarily, because once again, there is a lot of, we are quite happily we generally speaking, as kind of globally a community of people who work with contemplative methods, psychological methods, different modalities of therapy and so forth, and even pop psychology as well, have very unfortunately moved away from this false dichotomy of expression versus suppression. It was a very false dichotomy that was very problematic and did a lot of harm. But basically the essence of that was that you can either express your problematic mental states or suppress them. There's no third option. Either you're expressing or you're suppressing. And if you're expressing is probably good, and if you're suppressing, you will have cancer. So that was kind of the pop psychology version of it that was very heavily promoted. Then the problem with expressing also became obvious, because just by expressing a problematic mental state, you just deepen the habit of having it. So your neural pathways get deeper with regards to that mental state. Your mental habit of having that mental state becomes deeper. You're basically strengthening the pattern. So, okay. Then it became obvious, and that was always the Buddhist idea, that these are not the only 2 options that are available. So, with regards to this, what is the difference between suppressing these thoughts and holding them in a space of silence? Were I to try to suppress them, and suppression actually quite often refers to speech and body, even though probably there is a way of doing suppression with the mind as well. But for most people, suppression as actually a survival strategy is used on the levels of body and speech. But let's not go into this whole discussion right now. However, if I were to, let's say, suppress those thoughts actively, right? I'd be like, no, be quiet. Or I would pretend that they're not there. Whereas here, I am acknowledging that they exist. I am acknowledging that these thoughts, these problematic judgmental thoughts that I don't want to strengthen or embed even more deeply into my mind, right? I acknowledge they exist, and I acknowledge the fact that these are specific configurations of my mental energy, specifically of my verbal mental energy, my verbal thoughts. Out of habit, due to specific patterning, it is now manifesting in the form of these mental... I got too excited. They are manifesting in this form of these verbal thoughts. So I'm acknowledging that. I'm not even chasing those thoughts away. But I'm listening to the silence that's underneath them, to the silence that's beyond them, to the silence that's behind them. And that's what makes all the difference. So it's as if we're having layers in a graphic editor. So there's a layer, semi-transparent layer, or a layer that becomes semi-transparent of these judgmental thoughts. Initially, it was fully non-transparent. I could not see anything through it. It was like a piece of paper. Oh, there's nothing through it. But now suddenly, because I know that there is something underneath that, and not simply the underlying issue or, many years of abuse or something like that, but something even more deeper than anything that's specifically related to my life. There is something deeper there. The primordial space, which manifests on the level of my speech as silence. There is something deeper there. So by attending to that deeper level without ignoring or denying the fact that there are these specific verbal thoughts arising here and now, I'm kind of bringing the two truths together. There is a deeper level, and I can relax into that. And yet there is this problematic patterning that's occurring right now. Okay, no big deal. So it's in their dance that the problem gradually gets resolved. Were I to ignore the fact that there is this patterning, were I to simply say, hey, emptiness, that would not be entirely helpful. That would be spiritual bypassing. Because I'm ignoring the very basic fact that that there are now judgmental thoughts. Another unhelpful thing would be to fully identify myself with them and say, hey, I am just these judgmental thoughts. I hate myself because I am judgmental thoughts. That's also unhelpful, So not falling into the extreme of denying reality, not falling extreme into exaggerating reality or the reality of these thoughts, but kind of enjoying the multiplicity of layers within our mind and looking through the unhelpful, temporary, problematic layer, that is these knots, into the deeper layer and allowing that interplay to work with the problem. So the same can be applied to the issues of self-forgiveness. Because it's this feeling of not forgiving ourselves, this feeling of being uncomfortable with ourselves, this feeling of hating ourselves on occasion. These are just knots or beautiful monsters, or these specific, temporary, conditioned configurations of mental and emotional energy. And these are accompanied also by certain patterns of verbal behavior and physical behavior. Okay, so that's one layer, right? So we make it semi-transparent, and we'll look through it to the deeper level that is stillness, silence, and spaciousness. And through that, over time, many of these things will get released. So that's now the third strategy. Not just expression, not just suppression, also this. Holding in awareness against the background of the three pills. And then there's also the fourth strategy, which is to change the patterning into constructive patterning. So from judgmental thoughts, move on to thoughts that are, for example, full of loving kindness or compassion or wisdom and so forth. And that's another approach that, of course, Buddhism very heavily promotes and that we will start exploring once we get to the practice of loving kindness proper. But before that, there's one more step that we will explore in our last session for today in an hour. This step will finally be our ultimate preparation before initiating the practices of first tenderness and then loving kindness and compassion. So I'm hoping to see you all in an hour, hoping that you enjoy your break, and see you all very soon. Thank you.